The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where time felt frozen and mistakes echoed longer than they should. People filled the wooden benches in low murmurs, some there for justice, others just to watch it happen to someone else. At the front, beneath the seal on the wall, a black man stood with his hands cuffed in front of him, wrists marked red where the metal bit too tightly. He wore a plain gray suit that didn't hide his build. Broad shoulders. Thick forearms. A body shaped by years of discipline rather than comfort. His face showed no panic, no confusion. Just focus. The kind of calm that came from surviving things far worse than a courtroom full of strangers. The cop standing behind him didn't see that. Or maybe he did and hated it. "You don't look so tough without your uniform, do you?" the cop muttered, leaning closer than necessary. His breath carried the sharp scent of coffee and arrogance. The man in cuffs didn't turn. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Silence was something he had mastered long ago. The judge hadn't entered yet. Court was minutes from starting, and the room buzzed with idle talk. A woman whispered to her husband. Someone laughed quietly in the back. Phones were tucked away as the bailiff called for order. The cop shifted his weight, annoyed by the man's stillness. He wanted a reaction. Fear. Anger. Anything to confirm the story he had already written in his head. "You people always think you're special," the cop said, voice low but sharp. "Like the rules don't apply to you." Still nothing. The cop's jaw tightened. He glanced around, making sure no one important was watching. In his mind, this man wasn't a veteran. Wasn't anything worth respect. Just another defendant. Another body in chains. That thought made what he did next feel justified. The kick landed hard against the back of the man's knee and lower ribs. A sudden, violent impact that echoed through the courtroom louder than it should have. The man lurched forward, catching himself before he fell, the cuffs rattling loudly. A gasp rippled through the benches. "What the hell?" someone whispered. The man steadied himself slowly, breath controlled, muscles tightening as pain flared through his side. He had felt worse. Broken bones. Shrapnel. The burning shock of wounds that came with screaming and blood. This was sharp, but familiar. He didn't cry out. Didn't curse. Didn't even look back. That confused the cop more than anger ever could. The judge entered at that moment, robes swaying slightly as he took his seat. "Order," he said automatically, not yet aware of what had just happened. "Let's proceed." A woman in the front row raised her hand halfway, then dropped it, unsure if speaking up would make things worse. A young man nearby clenched his fists, eyes locked on the cop, but said nothing. The cop stepped back into position, smugness returning to his posture. In his mind, the moment had passed. Authority had asserted itself. No consequences. The charges were read out loud, each one delivered without emotion. Assault. Disorderly conduct. Resisting arrest. The words painted a picture that didn't match the man standing there, but stories like that rarely needed to. As the judge droned on, the man's thoughts drifted despite himself. He remembered sand under his boots. The weight of gear digging into his shoulders. The hum of aircraft engines in the dark. Commands whispered then obeyed without question. He remembered trusting the man beside him with his life, knowing that trust was mutual. Here, none of that mattered. "Do you understand the charges against you?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied. Some people looked up then, surprised by his voice. Calm. Clear. Educated. Not what they expected. The cop's smile faded just a little. The judge peered down at him. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty." A scoff came from somewhere behind him. The cop shifted again, leaning forward. "Bold choice," he murmured. The man ignored him, eyes steady. The public defender assigned to him shuffled papers nervously, clearly overwhelmed and underprepared. "Your Honor, we request." "Denied," the judge interrupted impatiently. "We'll proceed as scheduled." The man felt the familiar frustration tighten in his chest. Not fear. Not despair. Just the cold understanding that systems often moved without caring who they crushed along the way. As proceedings continued, the cop's presence loomed behind him like a shadow. Every movement felt watched, judged, waiting for another excuse. The man's side throbbed where the kick had landed, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him grounded, present. At one point, the cop leaned in again. "You think anyone here's gonna believe you?" he whispered. "Your word against mine." The man finally turned his head slightly, just enough to look at him from the corner of his eye. Not threatening. Not defiant. Just observant. The cop felt something twist in his stomach and straightened abruptly. Court recessed briefly, and the judge announced a short break. The man was guided toward the side holding area, chains clinking softly. As he walked, he noticed the stares. Some sympathetic. Some curious. Some cold. A young woman met his eyes and mouthed, "I'm sorry." He gave her a small nod. Inside the holding area, the door closed with a heavy thud. The room was bare. A bench. A phone mounted on the wall. Fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The bailiff looked uncomfortable. "You all right?" he asked quietly, avoiding eye contact. "Yes," the man said. The bailiff hesitated. "You want water or something?" "No, thank you." The bailiff nodded and stepped out. Alone now, the man exhaled slowly. His ribs ached, but his mind was sharp. This wasn't over. He knew that. Situations like this never ended quietly on their own. His fingers brushed against the folded paper hidden in his pocket. He had almost forgotten it was there. Almost. The public defender had insisted earlier, voice rushed and uncertain. Just in case, keep this number. I don't know who it is, but they said to call if things went sideways." At the time, the man hadn't thought he would need it. Now, he unfolded the paper. A single number. No name. He stared at it for a long moment, weighing options the way he always had. Assess. Decide. Act. He picked up the phone. As it rang, his heart didn't race. His hands didn't shake. But deep down, something shifted. A quiet sense that whatever happened next would change the direction of the day in ways no one in that courtroom was ready for. The line clicked. "Yeah?" a voice answered. The man closed his eyes briefly. "It's me." On the other end, the silence was instant. Heavy. Alert. "Where are you?" the voice asked. "County Courthouse." "What happened?" The man glanced at the door, then down at the bruising already forming along his ribs. "I'll explain later." Another pause. Shorter this time. Controlled, but edged with something dangerous. "Stay right there," the voice said. "Do not say another word to anyone." The call ended. The man placed the receiver back slowly, muscles relaxing just a fraction. Outside, the sounds of the courtroom filtered faintly through the walls. Voices. Movement. Ignorance. He sat down on the bench and waited. Because the first blow had already been struck. And no one yet realized what they had just started. When they brought him back into the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before. Not louder, not angrier, just tense, like everyone sensed something had shifted but didn't yet know what it meant. Conversations died down faster this time. Fewer whispers. More staring. The cop noticed it too. He walked a step closer than necessary as the man in cuffs took his place again. The smug confidence from earlier was still there, but now it had an edge, sharpened by irritation. He didn't like uncertainty. He especially didn't like the feeling that something was happening without his permission. "You make your little call?" he asked under his breath. The man didn't respond. His face was calm, eyes forward, posture unchanged. That silence felt louder now, almost intentional. The judge cleared his throat and resumed proceedings, his voice clipped, impatient. He wanted efficiency, not drama. Papers shuffled. Dates were read. Procedures followed. But the room refused to settle. A man in the gallery leaned forward, squinting at the defendant like he was trying to solve a puzzle. A woman across the aisle folded her arms tightly, jaw set, eyes never leaving the cop. Somewhere in the back, a phone vibrated once before being silenced. The cop felt eyes on him. That annoyed him more than the man's silence ever had. He shifted his stance and nudged the man forward with the toe of his boot. Not hard enough to cause another scene. Just enough to remind him who was in control. "Stand straight," he muttered. The man complied, but slowly. Deliberately. As if every movement was a choice, not a command. The judge glanced up. "Is there a problem?" "No, Your Honor," the cop said quickly. "Just keeping things orderly." The judge nodded and looked back down, satisfied. But the man in cuffs noticed the slight tremor in the cop's voice. Barely there. Almost nothing. But enough. The prosecutor stood and began summarizing the case, painting a picture of chaos and aggression. A man who had refused lawful orders. A man who had escalated a routine interaction. A man who was clearly unstable. Each sentence landed like a quiet insult. The man listened without expression. He had heard worse lies told with more conviction. What mattered wasn't the words. It was who believed them. The public defender tried to object once. Then twice. Each time, the judge waved him off. "Save it for trial," the judge said curtly. The cop smirked again, relief flooding back in. This was how it always went. Authority closed ranks. Doubt disappeared. People forgot what they thought they saw. He leaned in close once more. "Told you," he whispered. "Nobody cares." For the first time, the man turned his head fully. Their eyes met. There was no threat in the look. No promise of violence. Just clarity. Awareness. The kind that came from knowing exactly where you stood, and where the other person didn't. The cop felt a chill crawl up his spine. He straightened abruptly, taking a step back like he'd brushed against something sharp. The judge called for another brief pause while paperwork was reviewed. The courtroom stood again, restless now. People moved toward the doors, murmuring more openly. "That cop crossed a line," someone whispered. "I saw it too," another voice replied. "He kicked him. For no reason." The cop heard fragments of it as he stood near the wall. His jaw tightened. He scanned the room, memorizing faces, deciding who he'd need to remember later. The man in cuffs was guided to the side again, but this time the bailiff avoided the cop's eyes entirely. "Sit tight," he said quietly, unlocking the chain connecting the man to the railing but leaving the cuffs on. The man nodded once. Minutes passed. Then footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not the casual shuffle of court staff. These were measured. Purposeful. Multiple. The cop noticed first. His head snapped toward the doors, hand instinctively resting near his belt. "What now?" he muttered. The doors didn't open yet. But voices carried through the thick wood. Low. Controlled. Not arguing. Instructing. The judge frowned, clearly irritated. "What is this delay?" The bailiff stepped toward the doors, peering through the narrow glass panel. His eyes widened slightly before he caught himself. He turned back to the judge, face pale. "Sir," he said carefully, "there are visitors." The cop scoffed. "Visitors? This isn't a hotel." Before anyone could respond, the doors opened. 3 men entered. All in dark suits. No visible weapons. No visible badges. But the way they moved commanded attention instantly. They didn't rush. Didn't hesitate. They walked like they knew exactly where they were supposed to be. The room fell silent. The man in front scanned the courtroom once, eyes sharp and assessing. When his gaze landed on the man in cuffs, something hardened in his expression. He took 2 steps forward. "Who's in charge here?" he asked calmly. The judge stood immediately, color draining from his face. "I am." "And you are?" The man reached into his jacket and produced a badge, holding it up just long enough for the judge to see. The judge swallowed hard. "Yes," the man said, voice firm but controlled. "That's me." A ripple of confusion spread through the benches. The cop squinted, trying to read the badge from where he stood. He couldn't make out the details, and that made his stomach knot. "What's this about?" the judge asked. The man in the suit didn't answer him right away. Instead, he walked directly toward the man in cuffs. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the man replied. The cop stepped forward. "You can't just—" The man in the suit turned slowly. The cop stopped mid-step. "What's your name, officer?" the man asked. The cop hesitated. Just for a second. "Why?" "Because I want it," the man replied. The judge cleared his throat. "Sir, if there's an issue, we can address it through proper channels." "We are," the man said. "Right now." He looked back at the cop. "Uncuff him." "That's not your call," the cop snapped, louder now. "Defensive." "He's a defendant." The man's voice dropped, quiet but razor sharp. "That's my call." The bailiff didn't wait for further instruction. He moved quickly, unlocking the cuffs. Metal clinked softly as they fell away. The man rolled his wrists once, flexing his fingers. He didn't look at the cop. He didn't need to. The cop took a step back, panic flickering behind his eyes. "This is insane," he said. "You can't just come in here and yet here we are," the man in the suit replied. He turned to the room. "This individual is an active duty Navy SEAL. His presence here is the result of multiple failures, starting with an unlawful arrest and ending with an assault inside this courtroom." A collective gasp swept through the benches. The cop's mouth opened, then closed. "That's not true." "It is," the man said calmly. "And it's all on record." The judge's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the bench. I wasn't informed." "You should have been," the man replied. "But that's a conversation for later." He turned back to the SEAL. "You ready to go?" The man nodded once. As they moved toward the doors together, the cop stood frozen, realization crashing down on him in waves. The whispers had turned into murmurs now. Phones were out. Eyes were everywhere. The SEAL paused at the threshold and glanced back, not at the cop, but at the room. "I stood here quietly because I believed the truth would surface," he said evenly. "It always does." The doors closed behind them. And in the sudden silence that followed, the cop understood something far too late. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of chill that seeped into bone rather than skin. The man walked between the suited visitors, his stride steady, eyes forward. Behind them, muffled voices rose and fell as the courtroom erupted into confusion, but none of it mattered now. What mattered was the quiet, controlled urgency in the way the men beside him moved. They didn't ask him to hurry. They didn't need to. At the end of the corridor, a door opened into a smaller conference room. Plain. Windowless. A long table, a few chairs, a camera mounted in the corner that blinked red. The door closed with a soft click that felt final. "Sit," one of the men said, not as an order but as an invitation. The man lowered himself into the chair, back straight, hands resting loosely on the table. His ribs still throbbed, but he ignored it. Pain was background noise. Awareness was everything. The man who had led them stood across from him, loosening his tie slightly. Up close, the authority in him was unmistakable. Not loud. Not dramatic. The kind that came from years of decisions that couldn't be undone. "We need your statement," he said. "From the beginning." The man nodded once. "I was stopped outside a convenience store. Asked for ID. I complied. Things escalated fast." "How?" another voice asked. "Assumptions," the man replied. "Tone. Hands where they shouldn't have been. I didn't resist." The man in the suit studied his face carefully. "And in the courtroom?" The man's jaw tightened slightly. "I was kicked. On camera," the man said. "We saw it." The man didn't react. He had expected that. "What you didn't see," the man in the suit continued, is how many people have already tried to bury this. The room fell quiet. Within 15 minutes of your arrest, the man went on. Reports were edited. Body camera footage was flagged for review. Statements were revised. By who? The man asked. People who assumed you wouldn't fight back, the man replied. Or couldn't. A faint smile touched the man's lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. The man in the suit leaned forward, placing his palms on the table. Here's the turning point. The call you made? It triggered a verification chain. That chain lit up systems that don't light up for just anyone. The man met his gaze calmly. Your file isn't just classified, the man continued. It's protected. The moment your name hit the local database, alarms went off. Another man slid a tablet across the table. On the screen were timestamps, highlighted segments of video, and a pause frame showing the exact moment the kick landed. The image was clear. Indisputable. This was uploaded automatically, the man said. Before anyone could touch it. The man exhaled slowly. Now here's where it gets complicated, the man added. The officer involved has a history. The tablet changed screens. Complaints. Settlements. Patterns. Each entry painted a clearer picture than the last. Most people never see this, the man said. Because most people don't have leverage. The man finally spoke, his voice low. I didn't want leverage. I wanted fairness. The man in the suit nodded. And that's exactly why this matters. Outside the room, footsteps echoed. A door opened somewhere down the hall, followed by raised voices. The sound of panic had a distinct rhythm. Rushed. Uncontrolled. They know, one of the men said quietly, glancing toward the door. Good, the man in the suit replied. Then we're right on time. He turned back to the man at the table. Here's what happens next. We go back in there. Not to rescue you. To expose the truth. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. What about the judge? He'll listen, the man said. Because now he has to. They stood together and left the room, the camera's red light blinking steadily as the door closed behind them. When they re-entered the hallway, it was chaos disguised as order. Officers stood in clusters, whispering urgently. A supervisor argued into a phone, face flushed. Someone tried to block the path and thought better of it at the last second. As they approached the courtroom doors, the noise inside surged, then quieted abruptly as the doors swung open. Every head turned. The man stepped in first this time, no cuffs, no chains. Just his presence. He felt eyes track him from every direction. Some shocked. Some ashamed. Some calculating. The cop stood near the defense table, hands clenched, eyes darting between faces. The earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle and desperate. The man in the suit addressed the room without raising his voice. We're placing this court on notice. The judge stood slowly, gripping the bench for balance. On what grounds? On grounds of misconduct, the man replied. Evidence tampering. Excessive force. An unlawful detention. A murmur rippled through the benches. The man in the suit gestured, and the screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. The pause frame of the kick filled the room. Gasps erupted. Play it, the man said. The video rolled. Clear. Unedited. From multiple angles. The sound of the impact echoed through the speakers, impossible to ignore. The cop took a step back, shaking his head. That's not. The man in the suit cut him off. Save it. The video continued. The whispers. The body language. The timing. Everything laid bare. The judge's face had gone ashen. Officer, he said slowly. Is this accurate? The cop swallowed. I was maintaining. Order? The judge finished. By kicking a restrained man? Silence. The man in the suit stepped forward again. There's more. Another video played. Body cam footage from outside the convenience store. Calm compliance. Raised hands. A shove. An escalation that came from only one side. The courtroom was silent now, the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest. The man felt something loosen inside him. Not relief. Not triumph. Just a quiet certainty that the truth had finally reached the surface. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. "This court," he began, then stopped, realizing how inadequate the words sounded. The man in the suit didn't wait. "This court will dismiss all charges. Effective immediately." The judge nodded stiffly. "Yes. Yes, of course." "And," the man added, "the officer involved will be relieved of duty pending investigation." The cop's knees buckled slightly as the weight of it hit him. He reached for the table to steady himself. The man watched him, expression unreadable. As officers moved in to escort the cop away, the man felt the room shift again. This time not with confusion, but with understanding. People weren't just watching anymore. They were learning. The man in the suit turned to him. "You good?" The man nodded. "I am now." They stood together at the center of the room, the aftermath settling like dust after an explosion. The judge cleared his throat, voice subdued. "Sir, I owe you an apology." The man met his gaze calmly. "Make it right," he said. "That's enough." As they turned to leave, the man felt eyes on his back, but they no longer burned. They weighed. Considered. Remembered. Outside the courtroom, the light felt brighter, sharper. The world hadn't changed. But something fundamental had. And everyone inside that room knew the final reckoning was still coming. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a dull, final sound, the kind that usually marked an ending. But this wasn't an ending. It was a release. The man stepped into the daylight, blinking once as the sun hit his eyes. The air outside felt different. Lighter. As if something heavy had been lifted not just from his shoulders, but from the entire building behind him. People were gathered on the steps now. Reporters. Bystanders. Phones raised, cameras already rolling. Word had traveled fast. It always did when authority cracked in public. The man paused for a moment, letting the noise wash around him without reacting. Years of training had taught him how to stand still while chaos unfolded. He felt the dull ache in his ribs, the reminder of how this had started, but it no longer carried anger with it. Just memory. The man in the suit stepped slightly ahead of him, raising a hand. The crowd quieted faster than expected. "There will be a full investigation," he said evenly. "All evidence has been preserved. No further statements at this time." Someone shouted a question about charges. Another yelled about the kick. A third asked who the man was. The man in cuffs no longer existed. He stepped forward on his own terms now. "I'm just someone who stood still," he said calmly. "Everything else speaks for itself." That was all he offered. They moved down the steps together, slipping past the growing crowd and into a waiting vehicle. The doors shut, sealing out the noise. Inside, it was quiet again. Controlled. Familiar. The man leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes briefly. Adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep, steady exhaustion. Not physical. Moral. The kind that came from holding restraint while being tested. "You handled that better than most," the man in the suit said from across the seat. The man shrugged slightly. "I've had practice." The vehicle pulled away from the curb. Through the tinted glass, the courthouse shrank into the distance, its stone facade suddenly less imposing than it had seemed hours earlier. "What happens to him?" the man asked quietly. The man in the suit didn't need clarification. "The officer?" "Yes. He'll answer for it," the man replied. "Not quietly. Not internally. Publicly." The man nodded once. That was enough. They rode in silence for several minutes, the city passing by in fragments of glass and concrete. People went about their lives unaware of what had just shifted. That was always how it worked. Change didn't announce itself. It just settled in. Eventually, the vehicle slowed and stopped near a small park. Trees lined the street, leaves stirring gently in the breeze. The man in the suit turned to him. "You're free to go." Medical will check you out later if you want. I'm good, the man said. He opened the door and stepped out, the door closing softly behind him. The vehicle pulled away, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. A woman walking her dog slowed as she passed him, studying his face. You okay? She asked. Yes, he said with a small smile. I am. She nodded and continued on, unaware of how much weight that simple question carried. He walked through the park, feeling the ground beneath his feet, the steady rhythm of movement grounding him again. He thought of the people in the courtroom. The ones who had gasped. The ones who had looked away. The ones who had learned something uncomfortable about power and silence. By evening, the news had broken fully. Footage played on every screen. The kick. The stillness afterward. The moment the truth forced its way into the open. Commentators argued. Officials released statements filled with careful language and sudden concern. The officer's name trended everywhere, stripped of protection by his own actions. The man watched none of it. He sat at a small table in his apartment, eyes pressed gently against his ribs, lights low. He replayed the day not with anger, but with analysis. Every decision. Every pause. Every choice to remain still when it would have been easier to react. His phone buzzed once. A message. Short. You did right. He typed back just 2 words. We all should. Later that night, the man stood on his balcony, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, the cops sat alone too, his world collapsing in on itself, reputation shredded, authority gone. Not because someone attacked him. Not because someone shouted louder. But because the truth had been allowed to stand. The man didn't feel satisfaction. He felt resolution. Justice wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. About showing that restraint carried more power than force ever could. Days later, charges were officially dropped. Investigations expanded. Other cases resurfaced. Patterns emerged. Doors that had been sealed for years began to creak open. All because one moment had been captured. One act had been witnessed. One man had refused to respond the way he was expected to. At a quiet ceremony weeks later, he stood among others like him. Men and women who had learned to endure in silence, to act only when necessary. There were no speeches. No medals. Just nods of recognition. As he left, a young recruit approached him hesitantly. Sir? He said, voice unsure. How did you stay calm? The man considered the question carefully. Because I knew who I was, he said finally. And I didn't need anyone else to prove it for me. The recruit nodded, understanding settling slowly. That night, the man returned home and folded the gray suit carefully, placing it at the back of his closet. He doubted he would ever wear it again. Somewhere, a courtroom sat empty, its benches polished, its walls silent. But the echo of that kick would remain. Not as a sound of cruelty. As a reminder. Power reveals itself most clearly when it is challenged by calm. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is stand still long enough for the world to expose itself.